Lieutenant Emma Carter stepped onto the base grounds just as the morning sun spilled over the tarmac, casting long shadows across the freshly painted hangars. Her black boots clicked rhythmically against the concrete, the sound crisp and deliberate, matching the measured cadence of her stride. She carried herself with a calm authority that drew the occasional glance from passing recruits, though none dared linger. Emma's uniform was impeccable, her insignia gleaming subtly under the sunlight. To the casual observer, she seemed like any other officer reporting for duty. But beneath the polished exterior lurked decades of training and countless operations that few could even imagine. The mess hall buzzed with activity as she entered. The smell of eggs, bacon, and brewed coffee filled the air, mixing with the faint metallic tang of the stainless steel tables. Emma moved through the crowd with quiet efficiency, her eyes scanning systematically. She noted the recruits' movements, their postures, and the minor mistakes that revealed inexperience. It was a habit she could never shake. Every room was a tactical map, every face a data point. Among the chaos, 5 recruits spotted her almost immediately. They were a tight-knit group brimming with overconfidence and teenage bravado. One of them, the self-proclaimed leader, nudged another. "Hey, check her out, she's alone," he whispered. "Think she can handle herself?" The others snickered, exchanging glances that carried both challenge and mischief. In unison they began to approach, their steps deliberate, circling Emma like sharks sizing up prey. They had no idea how dangerous their playfulness could become. Emma's head tilted slightly as if she sensed the disturbance but didn't immediately acknowledge it. Her dark eyes flicked toward the group, observing without emotion, almost as if calculating probability silently. She smiled faintly, a subtle curve of the lips, more enigmatic than friendly. The recruits mistook it for nervousness or uncertainty. Their confidence swelled. One of them made a joke, loud enough for a few nearby tables to hear, and the group laughed, brash and obnoxious. "What's the matter, Lieutenant? Lost your way?" Emma's response was deliberate in its delay. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, didn't make eye contact immediately. She moved toward the serving line with measured steps, keeping her pace slow enough to draw attention but not to intimidate. Every recruit, sensing an opportunity, closed the distance. They were unaware that she had noticed every detail, the spacing between them, the angles of their approach, the weight they were shifting onto their heels. As she reached for a cup of coffee, she set it down on the counter and adjusted her posture subtly, shifting her weight in a way that made her body ready for sudden movement. The leader of the group stepped closer, leaning slightly, testing the limits of personal space. Emma's eyes met his for the first time, dark and piercing. In that instant, he felt the weight of her attention like a physical force pressing against him. For a fraction of a second, the noise of the mess hall fell away. Nearby, a few seasoned officers glanced at the scene, nodding the tension. But Emma remained outwardly calm, blending effortlessly into the morning rush. Her presence was a paradox, at once approachable and unyielding, a lesson in subtle dominance. The 5 recruits, oblivious to the invisible lines they were crossing, continued their approach, emboldened by arrogance. They whispered, nudged, and exchanged smirks, convinced they were about to embarrass a seemingly ordinary officer. Emma's hand rested lightly on the counter, fingers splayed in a casual, almost careless manner. But every muscle in her body was coiled, ready to react with precision. Her mind raced through countless scenarios, calculating escape routes, potential threats, and necessary responses. All of it would remain hidden, invisible until the exact moment action was required. She did not hurry. She had no reason to. The recruits' mistakes were already their own undoing. As they closed in, 30 seconds seemed like an eternity. Emma took a deliberate sip of her coffee, her expression serene. Yet the faintest shift of her shoulders and the steely glint in her eyes warned that the calm was an illusion. The 5 recruits were about to learn a lesson in humility they would never forget. The storm had not yet arrived, but it was already poised, hidden behind a composed smile and measured posture. The 5 recruits moved closer, their swagger masking nervous anticipation. They had convinced themselves that this was a simple prank, an initiation test disguised as courage. "Step aside, Lieutenant," the leader said, trying to sound authoritative but betraying a hint of uncertainty. Emma's gaze followed each of them, unflinching, as if she could see not just their movements but the calculations behind them. Her posture remained relaxed, almost indifferent, but every subtle shift in weight hinted at readiness. Her presence alone began to distort the recruits' confidence. They were stepping into unknown territory, and instinctively some sensed it. One recruit reached for her shoulder, leaning in with a mocking grin. Emma's head tilted fractionally, eyes locking onto his with steely precision. She didn't flinch, yet the air between them seemed to thicken. The simple gesture, a touch he assumed harmless, was about to trigger an irreversible realization. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, fingers flexing subtly. There was no dramatic movement, no warning, but her body was taut, ready for action in a single heartbeat. The mess hall noise seemed to recede, conversations fading into a muted hum. Emma's calmness unnerved them. They had expected hesitation, fear, or perhaps anger. Instead, there was serenity, a quiet storm ready to erupt. The leader, sensing the subtle shift in energy, stepped back slightly, but the others pressed on. Their movements were hesitant, unsure, as if instinct tried to warn them. One muttered a joke, hopping to lighten the tension, but it landed flat, swallowed by the invisible authority Emma exuded. Each of her subtle gestures, a turn of the head, the shift of a shoulder, communicated precision and control that these young recruits could not comprehend. In her mind, Emma analyzed the situation with lightning speed. She mapped the room, noting the positions of nearby tables, chairs, and other personnel who could inadvertently intervene. She assessed the recruits' balance, muscle tension, likely reactions, and potential vulnerabilities. 30 seconds. That was all she needed to neutralize the threat safely, with efficiency and minimal confrontation. Her thoughts were cold, strategic, and detached, but her outward expression remained deceptively relaxed. Every step she would take was already pre-calculated. The recruit who had reached for her shoulder froze, feeling something intangible, an unseen weight pressing against him. Emma's eyes locked on his, and in that moment he sensed the presence of someone far beyond ordinary strength and skill. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to cause hesitation. The others noticed too, a ripple of doubt spreading through the group. Confidence wavered as instinct tried to alert them, but arrogance drowned out caution. They had underestimated her. One of the recruits tried to surround her from the side, thinking he could flank her easily. Emma shifted slightly, pivoting with seamless precision. In that movement, she subtly unbalanced him, forcing him to step back without any visible effort. Another recruit laughed nervously, realizing the room had changed its rhythm. Observers glanced over, sensing tension, though most couldn't pinpoint why. Emma's presence had transformed a simple mess hall encounter into a tactical engagement, invisible yet complete. The leader tried to regain control. All right, let's not," he began, only to halt mid-sentence. His words stumbled as Emma's gaze swept across them again, sharp, calculating, and unyielding. They felt pinned, not physically but mentally, trapped by the inevitability of her response. Every instinct screamed that this woman was not ordinary, that her calm was a weapon, her patience a trap. They had walked into a corner without realizing it, the situation silently ticking toward its conclusion. Emma's hand flexed lightly, still resting on the counter, ready. Her calm voice broke the tension. "Step back, now." It was not a request nor a threat, it was certainty incarnate. In 30 seconds, everything would change. The recruits didn't yet understand that the storm had already begun. All they could feel was the subtle, suffocating presence of someone who could dominate without a shout, without a move, until she chose to act. Emma's calm voice cut through the mess hall's chatter like a silent command. "Step back," she said, deliberate and measured, each word weighted with authority. Her tone was soft but unwavering, almost casual, yet it carried an invisible intensity that caused the 5 recruits to freeze mid-step. They glanced at each other, trying to mask their hesitation with forced bravado. One of them, the youngest, whispered a nervous joke. The words fell flat. Emma's eyes had already scanned his stance, noting how far he leaned forward, how tense his shoulders were. She shifted slightly, pivoting her weight with imperceptible precision. The recruit who had reached for her shoulder barely felt the subtle push of her presence, yet he stumbled slightly, regaining balance with an embarrassed laugh. The others were beginning to sense that something was wrong, but arrogance still clouded judgment. Their movements became hesitant, tentative, as if instinct whispered caution while pride overruled it. Emma's aura of control was invisible yet undeniable, wrapping around them like a silent net. Internal calculations raced through her mind, but her expression remained neutral. She analyzed spacing, angles, and the likely reactions of each recruit in the next 30 seconds. Each micro-movement mattered: the tilt of a head, the shift of weight, the flex of a hand. She read them as effortlessly as a map, anticipating every possible mistake. Her voice remained calm, unhurried, a soft anchor in the escalating tension. "I suggest you reconsider your approach," she said, almost conversational, yet the words carried the unmistakable certainty of experience. One recruit tried to regain dominance, stepping closer, attempting intimidation with a smirk. Emma tilted her head, eyes locking onto him, and he felt the invisible weight of her presence like a physical force pressing against his chest. His bravado faltered. He glanced at the others, but they were frozen too, caught between disbelief and instinctual fear. Emma's subtle warning was more effective than aggression. She didn't need to touch them. Every muscle in her body was coiled like a spring, ready to act with flawless precision. The room seemed to shift around them. Conversation slowed, forks paused midair, and a few instructors glanced over, sensing unusual tension but unable to define it. Emma remained calm, serene, yet every subtle shift of her shoulders and stance communicated readiness. She wasn't angry, she wasn't panicked, she simply existed in complete control. The recruits' nerves began to fray, though none could articulate why. 30 seconds had passed, but to them it felt like eternity. Each heartbeat was amplified as anticipation built. Emma's next movement was deliberate. She subtly pivoted, positioning herself to block the escape routes without a visible step. The leader tried to make a commanding gesture but hesitated, feeling the weight of her attention. The others, sensing the unspoken warning, froze in place. Her calmness was suffocating, her serenity a trap. The invisible lines of control she drew were already inescapable. "Step back," she repeated, soft and precise, each syllable slow and deliberate. The recruits flinched, eyes widening, adrenaline beginning to spike. They had underestimated her, and instinct now whispered danger. Emma's calm, quiet presence was far more intimidating than any shout, any physical display. It was a warning born of experience, training, and confidence so absolute that resistance seemed foolish. One by one, the 5 recruits realized, almost simultaneously, that this woman was no ordinary instructor. Something in the way she measured them, anticipated their moves, and radiated control told them they had crossed a line. Their arrogance faltered. Hesitation replaced bravado. Pride battled instinct, and instinct was losing. Emma's subtle warning had already changed everything. All that remained was for her to decide the final outcome. The leader of the group, frustrated by the sudden hesitation among his peers, made a reckless move. He lunged toward Emma's bag, thinking to assert dominance with a show of bravado. The others followed, emboldened by his initiative, their steps uncertain but forceful. What they didn't realize was that Emma's entire body had already shifted into a position of complete tactical readiness. One fluid pivot of her shoulders, one subtle movement of her feet, and the momentum of their actions would be hers to control. She did not panic. She did not shout. She simply reacted with precision. The young recruit who had reached for her shoulder was the first to feel the consequence. Emma shifted her weight slightly, her hand brushing lightly against the counter as if to maintain balance, yet the pressure redirected his momentum. He stumbled backward, blinking in surprise, regaining balance awkwardly. The leader froze, eyes widening, sensing the first crack in their perceived control. Emma's movements were almost invisible, imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to those who understood subtle mastery, every shift of her weight and every glance conveyed command. The mess hall seemed to slow around them. Chairs scraped lightly on the floor, conversations faded, and distant clinks of silverware became background noise. Emma's focus was absolute. Every recruit's stance, every hesitation, every micro-adjustment was cataloged and processed in seconds. She anticipated where each would move next, predicting their reactions to her subtle cues. The 5 young men had stepped into a corner they didn't see forming, a trap constructed from decades of experience and instinct honed under extreme conditions. One recruit, trying to regain confidence, moved toward the side, attempting a flanking maneuver. Emma's head turned slightly, her eyes catching the smallest motion. Without a sound, she shifted her position, blocking his path with minimal effort. Her foot placement, subtle yet strategic, ensured that his momentum was directed away from her. Panic flickered in his eyes, quickly followed by disbelief. None of the 5 had yet seen her act with overt force, yet their confidence was eroding faster than they could comprehend. The leader tried to regain control, raising his hands in a half-hearted gesture of command. Okay, back off," he shouted, voice cracking slightly. Emma's gaze remained steady, unblinking, almost serene. There was no anger, no threat, no haste, yet every word he spoke was met with silent authority that rendered him ineffective. His peers looked at him nervously, realizing that their combined bravado had collapsed under her calm scrutiny. Emma's hand flexed lightly against the counter, ready to act if necessary. Each recruit now felt trapped, not by brute force but by an invisible net of control and anticipation. 30 seconds had passed since they first cornered her. In that brief interval, their perceived dominance had been dismantled without a single punch thrown, without a shout or gesture of aggression. Emma's mastery of subtle movement, awareness, and tactical timing left them frozen, unsure, and entirely at her mercy. Nearby officers glanced over, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding, though they did not intervene. Emma had transformed a simple confrontation in the mess hall into a controlled tactical engagement, all while appearing calm and composed. The 5 recruits, once brash and confident, now struggled to reconcile their fear with their confusion. Every instinct screamed caution, but their minds lagged behind the reality of the situation. They had underestimated her. Finally, the leader faltered, stepping back, glancing at his comrades who mirrored his hesitation. Emma's calm, measured presence dominated the room, leaving no room for further challenge. Their arrogance had collapsed entirely. They were on the edge of comprehension, about to discover the truth of the woman standing before them. 30 seconds more would bring clarity, reality they could not yet grasp. The moment of revelation was imminent. In an instant, the 5 recruits realized they had miscalculated entirely. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by raw, instinctive fear. Emma's movements were seamless, each pivot, each subtle shift of weight had rendered them trapped without a single injury, without a word raised in anger. She had dismantled their overconfidence as effortlessly as a masterful chess player capturing pieces in a single sweep. The leader swallowed hard, realizing the mess hall's chaos had faded into a singular focus on the woman before them. Emma's eyes scanned the 5, noting the tremors of uncertainty in their postures. Her voice remained calm, carrying the quiet authority that had pinned them in place. "Step back," she said, measured, her tone both a warning and a declaration. There was no room for misinterpretation. The recruits froze, realizing that compliance was the only option. Their brains raced, trying to reconcile the visible calm of her demeanor with the invisible mastery they felt pressing down upon them. A senior officer who had been observing from a nearby table finally stepped forward, breaking the tension with a simple nod toward Emma. The gesture spoke volumes. "She's a Navy SEAL," the officer said quietly, confirming what had already been implied by her movements, her composure, and her tactical precision. The words landed like a shockwave. The 5 recruits' eyes widened, disbelief etched on every face. The woman they had tried to corner, thinking they could intimidate or embarrass her, was not only trained in elite combat operations, she had decades of experience they could scarcely imagine. The leader stammered, his confidence completely shattered. I didn't know, he admitted, voice cracking as all replaced arrogance. The others echoed similar murmurs, unable to form coherent thoughts. Every instinct screamed respect, every ego fractured. Emma's subtle smile was almost imperceptible, an acknowledgement that they were beginning to understand the magnitude of her skill. She adjusted her uniform casually, brushing off imaginary dust as if nothing extraordinary had happened. To her, it had been a routine demonstration of control. To the recruits, it was a revelation that would haunt their training for months. Nearby personnel whispered among themselves, recounting every minor movement they had witnessed, the pivot of her shoulders, the minimal but precise steps, the way she had used their own momentum against them. Emma had neutralized 5 overconfident recruits in under 30 seconds without striking a single blow, without shouting, without raising her voice. The quiet efficiency of her actions left a deep impression. Respect rippled through the room, replacing the tension that had gripped the mess hall moments before. The recruits glanced at one another, faces pale, hearts racing. Arrogance and overconfidence had been replaced by humility and awe. They realized they had not been tested. They had been educated forcibly and quietly in the lethal subtleties of professional combat awareness. Their earlier laughter and joking felt foolish almost in the light of Emma's flawless execution. One by one, they nodded slowly, acknowledging their misjudgment, understanding that this was more than discipline. It was mastery. Emma finally stepped away from the counter, moving as if resuming her breakfast routine, fluid and unhurried. Each recruit felt a magnetic pull of respect, the awareness that they had witnessed something exceptional. The lesson was clear: never underestimate experience, composure, and absolute control. The 5 young men had entered the mess hall thinking to assert dominance, only to find themselves humbled by the quiet might of a Navy SEAL. The realization settled heavily on them, teaching a lesson in humility, skill, and authority that no drill instructor could replicate with mere words. For Emma, the incident was insignificant, just another morning at the base. For the recruits, it became legend, a story repeated with awe and whispered reverence across the halls. Their understanding of power, discipline, and skill had changed in 30 seconds, forever marked by the presence of a woman who moved like lightning in silence and struck like a force they could barely comprehend. Respect, fear, and admiration intertwined, leaving them humbled, educated, and inspired. The mess hall gradually returned to its usual rhythm, though the atmosphere had shifted. Forks clinked, trays slid across tables, and distant conversations resumed, but beneath the ordinary sounds lingered a quiet tension. Emma sat back down at her table, picking up her coffee as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Her movements were effortless, calm, and precise, signaling that the previous confrontation had been trivial, routine even. Yet for the 5 recruits, nothing would ever feel routine again. They stood awkwardly a few feet away, still processing the events. Faces pale, eyes wide, hearts hammering in their chests, they had underestimated her. Their previous swagger was gone, replaced by a humbling awareness of their own naivety. One whispered to another, disbelief cracking his voice. "Did you see what she just did?" The other nodded, unable to speak, every muscle tense with residual adrenaline. They had been humbled in under 30 seconds, outmatched without physical violence, outclassed without effort. Nearby recruits who had witnessed the encounter shared hushed conversations, eyes darting between Emma and the 5 humbled students. Whispers spread quickly, recounting every detail: the pivot of her shoulders, the subtle shifts that controlled the room, the precise timing of every motion. Emma's quiet authority was now etched into everyone's consciousness, a living lesson in power and discipline. For the untrained eye, it had seemed like a calm exchange. Yet the subtle mastery she demonstrated had rewritten the unwritten rules of respect in the mess hall. The 5 recruits exchanged glances, their egos fractured but slowly rebuilding into something more aware. They had entered the room brimming with arrogance, expecting laughter and dominance, only to leave enlightened and humbled. One muttered barely audibly, "We messed with the wrong person." No one laughed. It was acknowledgement of truth. For the first time, they truly understood that respect wasn't demanded. It was earned quietly, with skill, presence, and composure. Emma noticed the subtle tension among the other trainees, but she paid it little attention. Her eyes scanned the room, observant yet relaxed, drinking in the ordinary chaos of the mess hall while remaining acutely aware of every movement. She spoke lightly to fellow instructors, chatting and smiling in a way that seemed perfectly ordinary. But every word, every gesture was measured. No one could see the weight of authority she carried, the lessons she had silently imparted in mere seconds. As the day progressed, the 5 recruits slowly reintegrated into their routines, still whispering about what had happened. Their movements were more cautious, their posture more deliberate. They avoided unnecessary confrontation, eyes occasionally flicking toward Emma, a mixture of awe and lingering fear. Some began reflecting on their arrogance, reassessing the way they approached authority and skill. The incident became more than a story. It became a lesson, a turning point in their training and mindset. Nearby instructors and senior personnel who had observed the encounter exchanged quiet smiles. They recognized what had happened and the impact it would have on the recruits. Emma had demonstrated the kind of control, awareness, and skill that could not be taught in a classroom or through drills alone. She had turned a simple encounter into a living, breathing lesson in tactical mastery, discipline, and respect. By the time Emma left the mess hall, the ripple effects were evident. Recruits moved with more caution, conversations contained a newfound reverence, and a subtle hierarchy of respect had been established. The 5, in particular, carried the memory of the 30 seconds that had changed their perspective forever. Emma, as always, remained composed, leaving behind not chaos or fear, but a quiet, indelible impression that would ripple through the base for days, weeks, and beyond. In the days following the mess hall incident, the 5 recruits found themselves marked by a quiet, lingering awareness. Every step they took through the base reminded them of the woman who had dismantled their arrogance in 30 seconds. Their previous overconfidence had been replaced with vigilance, caution, and an emerging respect they hadn't expected. Emma Carter's presence had not just humbled them, it had reshaped the way they approached authority, discipline, and situational awareness. Her lesson extended far beyond a single encounter. The recruits' training routines shifted. Where once they had rushed exercises with reckless bravado, now they moved with calculated precision. Each drill became a measured test, an opportunity to internalize the subtlety of strategy, observation, and control that Emma had demonstrated. One recruit paused during physical training to adjust his stance, recalling the micro-shifts of weight he had observed in her posture. Another considered his reaction time during tactical simulations, realizing that Emma had anticipated their every move without breaking a sweat. Their humility had transformed into focused determination. Emma, meanwhile, maintained her composure, moving through the base with her usual calm authority. She did not lecture or berate. She allowed the recruits to learn through observation, correcting mistakes quietly and efficiently. Her approach emphasized subtle guidance rather than overt instruction. For her, this was natural. She had led men and women through far greater challenges, missions that demanded both composure and instinct. The lessons in the mess hall had merely been a microcosm of what she had always embodied: mastery through calm, calculated presence. The other trainees began to notice the change in the 5 recruits. Whispers circulated about their newfound focus, their careful attention to detail, and their growing awareness of surroundings. Some approached Emma, cautiously seeking approval or guidance. She acknowledged them with subtle nods or brief words of encouragement, never overemphasizing her role. Her quiet influence spread through the ranks without fanfare, teaching lessons through presence, action, and observation rather than harsh instruction. As the week progressed, the 5 recruits continued to reflect privately. Their pride, once inflated, had been tempered by experience. One of them muttered to a fellow trainee, "I didn't realize calm could be so powerful." The other nodded, recalling the way Emma had moved through the room, neutralizing a threat without aggression. They understood, finally, that skill, discipline, and respect were intertwined, inseparable, and far more effective than arrogance or force. Emma's 30-second lesson had left an indelible mark. During exercises and classroom drills, Emma continued to observe silently, stepping in only when necessary. Her eyes missed nothing. A poorly executed maneuver, a lapse in attention, or an overlooked detail drew her quiet correction. But more often she allowed the recruits to self-correct, watching as they internalized the principles she had demonstrated in the mess hall. Every subtle motion she had made in those 30 seconds became a teaching tool: precision, awareness, and calm decisiveness. By the end of the week, a subtle hierarchy of respect had formed across the base. Recruits watched Emma with quiet admiration, their behavior shaped by observation rather than fear. The 5 who had cornered her in the mess hall now carried a visible humility, their confidence tempered with self-awareness. They moved differently, thought differently, and approached challenges differently. Emma's influence had extended far beyond the confines of the dining hall. It had infiltrated the mindset of every trainee who had witnessed or heard the story. Emma herself remained seemingly unaffected, continuing her duties with effortless composure. Yet every glance, every gesture, every measured step reinforced the lesson she had imparted. The 5 recruits, once brash and overconfident, now approached training with discipline and caution, their respect for her actions shaping their daily choices. Her presence had become both a standard and a reminder. Mastery is quiet, calculated, and unwavering. The lesson was complete. Weeks passed, and the legend of the mess hall encounter spread quietly but steadily across the base. Recruits told the story in hushed tones between drills, embellishing details only slightly, yet never exaggerating the essence. 5 overconfident trainees had cornered a seemingly ordinary instructor, only to discover, in 30 seconds, that she was a Navy SEAL. The tale inspired awe and caution in equal measure. Emma Carter had become more than a figure of authority. She had become a symbol of skill, composure, and quiet dominance. The 5 recruits who had initially challenged her carried the story in their minds constantly. Each step they took through the base reminded them of the mistake they had made. Their training now carried an edge of humility and vigilance. They approached exercises with deliberate care, scrutinizing every movement, analyzing every angle, and anticipating outcomes with a newfound sense of awareness. Emma's influence had redefined their approach to authority and competence. Where once arrogance guided them, now caution and observation led their actions. Emma continued her work with effortless composure, blending seamlessly into the routines of the base. She never bragged or sought recognition, yet her presence was unmistakable. Every recruit, new and seasoned, instinctively gave her space, aware of the silent mastery she carried. Fellow instructors recognized her subtle control and influence, often remarking quietly on her ability to teach through observation, to command without confrontation, and to inspire through example. Her lessons were not loud or boisterous. They were internalized, permanent, and far more effective than any formal instruction. The 5 recruits began to model themselves after her approach. They improved dramatically in both physical and tactical exercises, absorbing not just skill, but the mindset behind it. Precision, patience, observation, and calm decisiveness became guiding principles. They were still young, still learning, but Emma's influence had planted the seeds of professionalism that would grow over the coming months. Their peers noticed the transformation, silently acknowledging the effect she had had. Respect for her was no longer optional, it was instinctive. Outside the confines of drills and exercises, Emma's reputation quietly extended across the base. Senior officers and seasoned instructors watched her interactions with admiration, recognizing the rare combination of technical skill, composure, and teaching prowess she displayed. No one questioned her authority. Her name carried weight, whispered with reverence in corridors, echoed with stories that reinforced her status. She had turned what could have been a humiliating encounter into a teaching moment, a permanent imprint on the mindset of those around her. Even the recruits who had not witnessed the mess hall incident firsthand were affected. Word spread quickly, and everyone approached their training with an understanding that Emma Carter's presence demanded respect. The 5 recruits, once arrogant and reckless, became examples themselves of how humility and discipline could transform performance. They carried Emma's lessons into every task, sharing her teachings subtly with their peers. Her impact radiated outward, shaping behavior, mindset, and attitude across the base. Emma herself remained unassuming. She moved through the base as she always had, calm, observant, precise. She said little, smiled faintly, and allowed her actions to speak louder than words. Yet in every glance, every slight gesture, every measured step, she reminded those around her that mastery was not loud, not brash, not desperate for recognition. It was quiet, calculated, and undeniable. As the weeks turned into months, the story of the 30 seconds in the mess hall became legend. It was retold with awe, with a touch of humor, but never with disrespect. Emma Carter's presence had left an indelible mark, a lesson in humility, respect, skill, and the silent power of mastery. The 5 recruits, once cocky and brash, would never forget the moment they had underestimated a Navy SEAL. And every new recruit who entered the base learned, whether directly or indirectly, that real authority requires no boasting, only skill, composure, and quiet confidence.